Hello everyone, my name is Miss Katrina and I'm here today with my little Humphrey, who's my little assistant here, to read you one of my favourite selections from my favourite Roald Dahl book, The Twits. Have any of you read The Twits? Mr. and Mrs. Twit are two of the most unpleasant people you are ever likely to meet. Not only are they grotesque to look at, but they are cruel and mean to everyone and everything they come into contact with, but especially to each other, playing horrible tricks on each other day after day. And the chapter that I would like to read from The Twits is one of my favourite ones, where Mrs. Twit gets revenge on Mr. Twit after a terrible frog trick that he plays on her, placing a big fat slimy frog in her bed, telling her it's a giant skiggly wiggler that will bite off your toes and eat them for breakfast, causing Mrs. Twit to faint, not hope for her to wake up and find the frog placed right on her face by none other than Mr. Twit. Well, this chapter is how Mrs. Twit gets her own back on Mr. Twit. The Worm Spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out to the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered in tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking around it with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. Oh, it's delicious. Eat up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy." "Oh, I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it very bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was so squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with the corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why it had a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. There. Did you enjoy that excerpt? That is one of my favourites, The Twits by Roald Dahl. If you would like to share your own favourite excerpt from any book that you enjoy reading, please feel free to comment in the box below. But for now, this is Miss Katrina signing off, but I'll be back very soon with another one of my favourite chapters.